The old cemetery stood at the edge of town, shrouded in a perpetual twilight beneath the gnarled branches of ancient oaks. It was a place that seemed to exist outside of time, where the past lingered in the air like a ghostly presence. It was a place of whispers and shadows where the veil between the living and the dead felt thin. The wind would often carry faint, eerie murmurs, as if the spirits themselves were trying to communicate with the living. Nastya and her friends, a group of teenagers seeking a thrill, gathered at its rusted gates, their laughter echoing through the stillness. They were drawn to the cemetery's eerie allure, a dare to summon spirits fueling their adolescent curiosity. They were drawn to the cemetery's eerie allure, a dare to summon spirits fueling their adolescent curiosity. The idea of contacting the other side was both terrifying and exhilarating, a perfect mix for a night of adventure.
I can't shake this feeling, like we're crossing a line, venturing into a realm where we don't belong. It's like we're disturbing something that should be left alone.
Her friends, emboldened by bravado and youthful invincibility, dismissed her concerns as childish fear. They laughed it off, eager to prove their courage and unwilling to back down from the challenge. They entered the cemetery, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path, their voices hushed as they moved deeper into its heart. The further they went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change, growing heavier and more oppressive. The air grew heavy, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling their nostrils. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet was alive with the memories of those who had been buried there.
Come on, Nastya. It's just a bit of fun. Don't be such a scaredy cat. We're just here to have a good time and maybe get a little spooked.
A sense of foreboding settled over Nastya, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was lurking in the shadows. She tried to convince herself it was just nerves, the power of suggestion playing tricks on her mind. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each step they took. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of unseen eyes watching their every move. It was as if the spirits of the cemetery were aware of their presence and were not pleased.
Relax, Nastya. It's just an old cemetery. Nothing's going to happen. We're just here to have some fun and maybe scare ourselves a little.
As they reached a clearing, marked by a crumbling mausoleum with ivy crawling up its walls like skeletal fingers, Nastya felt a cold spot settle over her. The mausoleum seemed to exude a malevolent energy, as if it were a gateway to another world. Nastya felt a cold spot settle over her. It was a chill that seemed to seep into her bones, making her shiver despite the warm night air. The laughter of her friends faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The cemetery seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, and Nastya felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with the presence of the supernatural. This was a place of sorrow, of forgotten memories, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were unwelcome guests. The cemetery was a resting place for the dead, and they were intruding on its sanctity.
This place is kinda creepy. Maybe we should head back? I don't think we should be here any longer.
But it was too late. They had already crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The spirits of the cemetery had been awakened, and they were not pleased. They were already in too deep. The fog began to thicken, obscuring their path and making it difficult to see. The once familiar landscape of the cemetery now seemed alien and threatening, as if it had transformed into a different place entirely. The cemetery path was a narrow ribbon of gravel, winding between weathered headstones and overgrown graves. Each step Nastya took seemed to echo in the stillness, the crunch of gravel underfoot a stark contrast to the eerie silence that enveloped the place. The headstones, some leaning precariously, bore the weight of countless years, their inscriptions faded and worn by time. The setting sun cast long shadows that danced and twisted, taking on sinister shapes in the fading light. The golden hues of the sunset painted the sky in a hauntingly beautiful palette, but the beauty was lost on Nastya. To her, the shadows seemed to reach out, as if trying to pull her into their dark embrace. Nastya felt a chill as she walked, the air growing colder with each step. It was as if the cemetery itself was breathing, exhaling a cold, damp breath that seeped into her bones. She pulled her coat tighter around her, but it did little to ward off the creeping cold. The weight of the cemetery's history pressed down on her, a palpable presence that sent shivers down her spine. She could almost hear the whispers of the past, the voices of those long gone carried on the wind. Each grave seemed to tell a story, and together they formed a chorus of sorrow and loss. She trailed behind her friends, her gaze darting nervously from shadow to shadow. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch set her heart racing. Her friends seemed oblivious to the oppressive atmosphere, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to her growing unease.
The darkness. It feels like it's holding its breath, listening to us, watching us. It's as if the cemetery is alive, waiting for something or someone.
Nastia's heart pounded in her ears, a drumbeat of fear against the silence of the cemetery. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, watching her every move. The fear was almost tangible, a living thing that wrapped itself around her, squeezing the breath from her lungs. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves intensified, mingling with a cloying sweetness that sent a wave of nausea through her. It was the smell of death, of things long buried and forgotten. She covered her nose with her sleeve, but the smell seemed to cling to her, refusing to let go. She stumbled on the uneven ground, her hand instinctively reaching out to steady herself against a moss-covered headstone. The stone was cold and slick beneath her fingers, and she quickly pulled her hand away, as if the touch had burned her.
Ah, it's so cold. It's like the cold is coming from the ground itself, seeping up through the earth.
The stone felt icy cold beneath her touch, and she recoiled as if burned. She wanted to turn back, to retrace their steps and escape the suffocating embrace of the cemetery. But the path behind them seemed to have disappeared into the shadows, leaving her with no choice but to press on. But her friends, caught up in the thrill of their dare, pressed on, their laughter echoing through the stillness like a challenge to the unseen forces that surrounded them. They seemed to find the whole situation amusing, their voices loud and carefree in the oppressive silence. Nastia, her fear growing with each step, had no choice but to follow. She couldn't let them see how scared she was, couldn't let them know that every fiber of her being was screaming at her to run.
Keep up, Nastia. We're almost there. Don't be such a scaredy cat.
Don't fall behind now, we're just getting started. There's so much more to see.
And so, despite her growing terror, she continued on, deeper into the heart of the cemetery. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the graves like a serpent. She could only hope that they would find their way out before the darkness swallowed them whole. The deeper they ventured into the cemetery, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Nastia felt a cold hand close around her heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the growing terror in her chest.
I think I hear something, whispers on the wind.
She thought she heard whispers on the wind, faint murmurs that seemed to slither around the edges of her hearing. They were just out of reach, impossible to decipher, but their tone sent chills down her spine. Each whisper was like a breath against her skin, cold and ethereal.
It's like they're coming from the shadows, from the very air itself.
The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as a wave of unease washed over her. She could feel eyes on her back, watching her every move. Her breath hitched in her throat and she quickened her pace, desperate to catch up with her friends. But the whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the shadows, from the very air itself surrounding her, closing in.
I can't take this anymore.
Nastia's fear threatened to consume her, her mind racing, her senses on high alert. She felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Despite her growing terror, Nastia couldn't bring herself to tell her friends what she was experiencing. The air around her felt thick with an unseen menace, a creeping dread that seemed to tighten its grip with every passing second. They were so caught up in their own excitement, so oblivious to the darkness closing in around them. Laughter echoed through the night, bouncing off the ancient tombstones, but to Nastia it sounded hollow, almost mocking. She didn't want to be the weak one, the one who ruined their fun. Her friends had been looking forward to this night for weeks, planning every detail of their spooky adventure. So she kept her fear to herself, a heavy weight settling in her stomach. Each step felt like a struggle, her legs heavy as if wading through thick mud.
I can't let them see how scared I am. I have to be strong, just for tonight. They'll think I'm just being silly. They'll laugh, and I'll never hear the end of it.
But as they rounded a bend in the path, Nastia's resolve shattered. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if they were alive and reaching out for her. She felt a presence behind her, so close that she could feel its breath on her neck. It was cold, unnaturally so, sending shivers down her spine. Her blood ran cold and she froze in her tracks, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The world around her seemed to blur, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer terror gripping her.
Oh no, please no, this can't be happening.
She didn't want to look, but an irresistible force compelled her to turn. It was as if her body was no longer under her control, driven by a primal instinct to face the source of her fear. Standing in the middle of the path, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight that pierced through the canopy of trees, was a young girl. The moonlight gave her an ethereal glow, making her appear almost otherworldly. She wore a long, white dress, her dark hair cascading down her back like a silken waterfall. The dress was old-fashioned, almost like something out of a different era. But it was her face that sent a scream rising in Nastia's throat. It was a face that should have been innocent, but was twisted into a mask of pure malice. It was a mask of malice, twisted and contorted, her eyes two black pits of despair. Those eyes seemed to bore into Nastia's soul, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The girl's lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. It was a smile that promised pain, a smile that spoke of unspeakable horrors.
Welcome to my world. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of menace that made Nastia's skin crawl.
Nastia's breath caught in her throat and her vision tunneled. The edges of her sight blurred and she felt as if she might faint. She felt a scream building inside her, a primal scream of terror that threatened to rip her apart. It was a scream that came from the deepest part of her being, a scream that demanded to be let out. But the scream died in her throat, choked by the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. Her body refused to obey, paralyzed by the fear that gripped her.
This can't be real. It has to be a nightmare. I need to wake up.
But it was real. The cold, the fear, the girl, they were all real. And it was only the beginning. The night was far from over, and the true horror was yet to come.